Okay, brilliant. So for everyone who didn't hear already, my name's Evie. I'm a research assistant for the Butterflies Through Time project at the Museum of Zoology. Today we've got a speaker whose name's Matt Hayes. He's a current PhD student at Cambridge University, but he was previously the old research assistant for the Butterflies Through Time project. He's going to be talking to us a little bit about what he's been doing over the past 2 years. He's been doing some fantastic outreach and engagement projects, as well as some research into butterflies and how they cope with temperature change. So before we go into it, I've just got a bit of a Zoom poll for you guys to do. So I believe I'm just gonna have a go at launching that now for you. This poll just gives us a bit more background into our audience, and it helps us give some feedback, and so we can improve our outreach and our events for the future. Okay, so let's have a launch into that. Just gonna give that a couple more seconds. You guys are brilliant. Okay. I think if we end that there. Perfect. Cool. And I think that is all from me. So Matt, if I stop sharing my screen, I'm going to hand you over to the lovely Matthew Hayes, who has been the research assistant for the Butterflies Through Time project for the past 2 years. He's done an absolutely brilliant job and is going to tell you all about it now.
Thank you very much, Evie. That's great. Just sharing my screen with you there. Cool. Yeah, thank you very much. So as said by Evie there, my name is Matt Hayes and I'm a PhD student in the Zoology department at Cambridge. I'm a member of the Insect Ecology research group, but before doing my PhD, as Evie said, I was working as the research assistant leading on the Butterflies Through Time project at the University Museum of Zoology in Cambridge, which has now been handed over to the brilliant Evie Crouch. So I won't spend too much time on this slide, but just to put this talk in context, this is the first of 6 talks happening over the next 6 weeks. So the next 5 talks will be from modern day researchers and conservationists featured in the Butterflies Through Time exhibition that's on display at the Zoology Museum at the moment, where they'll be talking to you about their work studying and protecting UK butterflies. But tonight I'm going to kick off by talking about the Butterflies Through Time project itself and giving an overview of the work that's gone into that over the last 2 years. So the tagline for Butterflies Through Time is using wildlife of the past to guide conservation of the future. And over the last 2 years, this project has sought to use museum butterfly specimens from the last 2 centuries to engage the public with wildlife both past and present and support modern day conservation in the process. So during the talk, I'll be going through the different specific aims we had for the project when it started, but then also talk about some of the ways we had to adapt it for COVID. So that obviously gave us quite a few difficulties, but believe it or not, it honestly did give us a few opportunities as well to kind of diversify the audiences we were talking to and broaden the scope of the project too. I will also be diving into the Zoology Museum specimens, the butterfly specimens that are usually stored behind the scenes, which were central to this project. So let's start with that by looking at the University Museum of Zoology in Cambridge. At the Cambridge Zoology department, we are really lucky to have this museum on site. It underwent a 5-year redevelopment to reopen in 2018. So now has the beautiful new gallery space that you can see on this slide, very shiny. It's really cool to be open again after lockdown as well. But what you might not know, and I certainly didn't know before I started working at the Zoology Museum, is quite how much material we store behind the scenes. So there's probably somewhere between 6,000 to 7,000 specimens on display in our public galleries at any one time. But there's estimated to be upwards of 2 million specimens actually stored on site at the Zoology Museum in storerooms like the ones you can see on the screen here. So less than 1% of the specimens we have on site are actually on display. The vast majority is still behind the scenes for things like preservation and research, but also just because there's physically not enough space to put everything on display at one time in the galleries. The largest of the stores is the Insect Storeroom, which is shown here. which is full of these cabinets you can see on the left of your screen, which is full in turn of drawers, which are in turn full of rows and rows of pinned insect specimens like the large blue butterflies you can see on the right of your screen here, each one with their own specific data label, so a little historical bit of information attached to each specimen there. We estimate that there are probably upwards of 1 million specimens in the insect storeroom alone. However, the insect collection is also the largest main collection left in the Zoology Museum yet to be electronically catalogued. So what I mean by that is, although we know roughly what we have in the storeroom, so we know which collections came in to the Zoology Museum in which years, none of the label data from the specimens themselves are easily accessible on a database. So researchers would currently have to come and physically visit the Zoology Museum, look at a drawer of insect specimens, take an insect out on a pin and look at the label to access that information. That's obviously not the easiest way to get information from these specimens, and that is where the Butterflies Through Time project and the funder for the project comes in. The work is funded by the Esme Fairburn Collections Fund, which, as written here, supports projects that develop collections to increase access and achieve social impact. And another crucial thing about this funding is all awarded funding is specifically tied to a designated museum collection. So in this case, it's the UK Butterfly Collection, and it means that the collection really is central to the project, because that is how funding is awarded. Okay, so how then did we go about increasing access to this collection and achieving social impact? Well, the project had three main goals, and the first one underpins the other two, which is cataloguing and digitizing the UK butterfly collection. So we're talking about specimens like this large swallowtail butterfly here in the top right. It would be great to catalogue the entire 1 million specimens in the insect stores, but we had limited funding, limited resources. I am supported by a great team, but the majority of a lot of this work is myself and a few others in the insect stores. So we had to choose a subset to be practical about it. Butterflies are a popular group of insects. I like to think that things like cockroaches are extremely important, and I think many of us know that's true, but it might be harder to garner support if we were cataloguing the UK cockroach collection rather than the UK butterfly collection, at least with the public. And there are estimated to be between 15 to 20,000 UK butterflies in our collection as well. So it's still a big number, and it's still a good chunk to get done, but it's more feasible on the 2-year timeframe that we've had. The second aim is to use the stories stored in these museum collections, including those of long-term declines and changes in local wildlife, to engage the public and wider audiences with what has been lost. So using these museum collections to show long-term changes. But also, we don't want to just be a message of doom and gloom. So we also want to then engage public audiences with wildlife they can still see around them today. So some of the insects in the stores are nearly 200 years old, collected by famous naturalists of the day. And that gives us another powerful aid to engage the public audience as well. If we can link them to kind of famous naturalists like Charles Darwin, for example, then that's another way for us to engage and interest audiences, and we'll touch on that later. The third goal is we want to support modern day wildlife conservation. So we can do this by providing long-term data from museum collections to conservation organisations like the Wildlife Trust for Bedfordshire, Cambridgeshire and Northamptonshire, who are partnered on the project. But also, I think even more importantly, is we can use our public engagement work to garner support for the management and conservation that they're doing in the local area too. So those are the main goals. Let's start with cataloguing museum specimens and how we went about doing that. The museum already has an electronic database called EMU, so Electronic Museum, and you can actually access all of the museum specimens that have already been catalogued, so insects or otherwise, via our online portal on our website. So there's a link here at the bottom. Don't worry about copying that link or writing it down. If you Google University Museum of Zoology online database or online portal, you'll be able to find it that way. Initially, for the Butterflies Through Time project, we have simply been adding to that resource and putting more data on EMU. So you can see some sort of example images here. If you look at the image on the left, you'll see a pinned insect specimen with data labels beneath it. And we've been going through the UK butterfly drawers at the Zoology Museum, noting down the taxonomic data, so the data of what species are in these drawers, and then transcribing their data labels. And if the collector has been good, they should have written down on these labels where and when these species were collected. There'll be other information on there as well. And we will put that information onto an Excel spreadsheet, and we'll add a unique ID number to the specimen pin so that we can relocate the specimen later if we need to. And then we upload all of that onto EMU, onto our electronic database, so people can access that data. However, another important part of the project was working to update this process to capture more data more quickly. So we've been talking to the Natural History Museum in London, who are at the forefront of digitizing collections, particularly their pinned insect collections. And we've gradually been trying to build a setup a bit like the one that they use there. So if you look at the middle picture, you will see someone at a computer screen, and on the left, there's a digital camera mounted on a stand with a macro lens. And beneath that, there's a light box with the specimen in with its data labels next to it. The idea with doing photographic cataloging is the first thing that you do is you take a picture of the specimen and its data labels. As you can kind of see on the right of your screen, that's an example there. And then that becomes the initial record of the specimen. You can actually transcribe the data labels later from the images. So that's really good, but importantly, this means you can do even more remote data collection as well. If you have a scale in your picture, you can actually do measurements of specimens remotely from all over the world. You don't need to come and visit the collection. If you put a color standard in the picture, you can also do things like color analysis on butterfly wings and things like that. So it's all about putting this stuff easily accessible online so that loads of people can use it for different purposes. We have trialed this at the Zoology Museum in Cambridge, and I'm happy to say it does work, which is great, albeit it is a bit slower and less slick than at the NHM because it's me and a small team. But the first species we tried this with was the checkered skipper, which you can see here on your screen. It's a good species to do first because, as I'll talk a bit about later, research is being done on its historical distribution at the moment to aid conservation efforts for it in this country. As I say, we'll mention this later, but it means it's a good starting point to show that we can actually do this photographic cataloging, which has been good to build upon. Providing remote access to the collections has also proven useful for other reasons too. The museum gets a lot of requests for researchers wanting to come and look at specimens, which makes sense. We've got a lot of them. The researchers either currently have to travel here to look at the specimens themselves, which means there's travel costs. There's an increased carbon footprint to do so, to look at the specimens in our collection, or we can send the specimens to them. And if we do that, that obviously risks some damage to the specimens from vibrations if they're being transported elsewhere. If we have a database online with all of these photographs, then they can actually do this work remotely and we risk less damage to the specimens. So for example, we had a request to look at some Pacific odonata, so these Pacific dragonflies you can see on the left here, where they wanted to get morphological pictures of the genitalia of the specimens to see if they could identify different species in our collection, which often you do by looking at the genitals. Using our cataloging setup, we were able to actually take these images for them remotely. So you can see on the left, you've got the overview of the specimen itself. And then if you go to the bottom left, you've got the pictures of the genitalia. And we could send these to the researchers and they're really happy with them. And these pictures that we took have actually been published now. And this helped them identify different species in our collection completely remotely without them ever having to visit. This was just done on request for one group that they were interested in. But imagine if all of our specimens are available online, what could be done and the amount of data that could be garnered from that. The Butterflies Through Time project also aimed to increase collaboration with other institutions, as well as catalogue some of their insect collections. So I've been working with specimens at the Wisbech and Fenland Museum. It's a small museum north of Cambridge, which has around 1,000 butterflies. And weirdly as well, Magdalen College in Cambridge, it has a private collection of over 7,000 butterfly specimens, which I've also catalogued and helped increase access to. I believe that a wealthy benefactor of Magdalen College said that basically they could have a lot of money from them, with one stipulation being that they would also have to look after their butterfly collection. So there's literally a meeting room where there's just randomly 2 cabinets in the back full of this amazing UK butterfly collection. And I don't think they were really quite sure what to do with it. So we went and catalogued that. And it makes you think, what other things are tucked away in colleges in Cambridge and elsewhere. There's probably more of this kind of thing out there. So it's really good to be able to increase access to that collection as well. Okay, so that's a brief overview of cataloging and the work we're doing there. The other two goals, of which one of them is public engagement, rely on cataloging that specimen data and the stories of decline and change that they document. So I want to demonstrate this to you by giving you one example of the kind of story that we're trying to engage the public with. So I want to focus on the museum collections of one particular person. And if you know me at all, then you'll know that this is going to be a naturalist called Leonard Jennings. Here is a picture of him. Jennings lived from 1800 to 1893, so very good age, especially in those days. He's probably most famous for being initially a rival and then a friend of Charles Darwin. And Jennings is actually one of two men who was offered the job as naturalist on HMS Beagle before turning down the offer and suggesting Darwin as a replacement, the other man being their joint mentor, who was John Stevens Henslow. I find that it's quite interesting to kind of dwell upon, because if Jennings had made a different decision, Darwin probably never would have gone to the Galapagos Islands and maybe wouldn't have formulated some of his theories of evolution by natural selection. It's quite that little bit of history could be quite different if Jennings had decided to go on this voyage. So Jennings was quite a big name in his day and clearly a notable naturalist, but I certainly hadn't heard of him really before studying him. And it's a shame, because he's on the boundaries of a really important part of history. And he's also really important to the Zoology Museum in Cambridge as well, for other reasons. So instead of going to the Galapagos Islands and traveling the world on the Beagle voyage, Jennings lived in Cambridgeshire for around 30 years, and he actually worked as a vicar in Swaffham Bulbeck, north of Cambridge. This gave him lots of free time in the countryside, pursuing his passion, collecting specimens and making recordings of wildlife. The material he collected was actually eventually donated to Cambridge University in 1865, and it formed part of the original nucleus of the collections we still have today at the University Museum of Zoology in Cambridge. And that's why he's important to our museum, because he helped formulate some of the first specimens that are stored here. You can see in this next slide an image of what the old museum galleries would have looked like closer to the time it first opened, long before the shiny new cabinets of the redevelopment in 2018. And here is a drawer of Jennings' specimens, his Hymenoptera, so lots of bees and wasps in this drawer, still all stored in the Zoology Museum to this day, each of them with labels pinned to them, each providing a little historical piece of data. But something probably even more important than the pinned insects from Jennings and other historical naturalists like him are Jennings' notebooks. Jennings took it upon himself to record notes for every single species he and his friends saw in Cambridgeshire almost 200 years ago. So we have 4 beautiful handwritten volumes in the museum stores. 3 are called Entomologia Cantabrigiensis, so the insects of Cambridgeshire, and there's 1 volume on the vertebrates as well, and so the larger animals. And he will, of course, missed some things, but because he lived in Cambridgeshire and recorded for nearly 30 years, these books give a pretty comprehensive list of what lived in the county 200 years ago, where they were found and how common they were. And that's really quite rare, because lots of collectors back in the day would have only collected certain species they're really interested in, or potentially from locations they happen to go on holiday. Having this kind of comprehensive list from one area is a really cool resource. And we can compare that with what lives in Cambridgeshire today to see how much things have changed. His notes basically record the story of decline that we want to use to engage the public with. So we can look at some examples as well. So Jennings' notebook entry, we'll look at the swallowtail at the top first, 1820 to 1849, found in the greatest plenty throughout the fens between Ely and Cambridge. And then we have the large copper butterfly. Jennings notes, not uncommon in Cambridgeshire. Well, this is one of the most, these are 2 of the most striking examples from his notes, really, because the swallowtail butterfly is now locally extinct. You can only find it in the wetlands of Norfolk in this country. And the large copper is now nationally extinct. So there may have been some unofficial reintroductions. It's basically been extinct in the country since the 1850s, 1860s, still found in Europe. showing the public extinct species from the local area that used to be common, with notes and specimens showing that they used to be found in this area, is one of the clearest ways to get across that large changes in wildlife have taken place. So museum collections allow us to shift baselines back in time, so that historical losses people aren't aware of can be brought into the light. And once you've established that things have changed, you can begin to ask why and engage people with what can be done about it. Well, these two species are wetland specialists, and this map shows the former extent of wet fenlands in the southeast of England. So that blue outline is the former extent. And throughout the last 500 years at least, this habitat has been progressively drained to make space for farmland. And it's thought that more than 99% of this biodiverse wet fenland habitat has been lost. Now, habitat means that the species that it supports have also disappeared. But not all of the wetlands did disappear. Some fragments did survive, and local conservation organisations like the Wildlife Trust, like the local Wildlife Trust, are working to restore and re-expand some of these areas as well. So there's a little dot here. You can see a little red outline. It looks like a drop in the ocean, but it's actually a 3,700 hectare reserve, the Great Fen, which the Wildlife Trust is working to re-wet and join up two old existing fragments of fenland which weren't completely drained. I should mention as well, a really exciting thing about the Great Fen is that they are also trialing wet farming practices there. And the idea is that it can be a vast landscape, which is going to be great for a whole wealth of different forms of wildlife, but also going to be a kind of commercially viable farming practice as well. So the best of both worlds is really exciting. And this is the kind of work we're trying to publicize as well. So after highlighting what has been lost using museum collections, which is, predominantly a sad message, we can then gain support for local conservation and show people where they can still interact with nature and how they can help support it and help protect it as well. So in addition to these extremely important stories of decline and conservation, tying our museum collections to famous naturalists from history can add another layer of interest to engage more people as well. So if I was to show you a single pinned beetle from our collection, it might not be that interesting to you. It probably should be, but it might not be, fair enough. If I was to show you one that was collected by Charles Darwin, the odds are you'd be a bit more interested. So here we have, I think it's a black night runner beetle from our Zoology Museum collection, and its data labels are shown alongside it. So you can see the top one, C. Darwin, that's Charles Darwin, collected this specimen, and it also found its way into Leonard Jennings' collection as well. X. Cole L. Jennings, so X collection, Leonard Jennings. We know they did used to go out beetle collecting together, and they appear to have exchanged beetles a bit like trading cards back in the day. If you had 4 of one beetle and your friend had one you didn't have, you could exchange them, that sort of thing. I should say that the note from Darwin is really not very useful. It just says near Cambridge and there's no date. If he was properly doing this, you should say exactly where you found it and when, so then it would be a useful long-term record. But I hear he did some other good stuff, so that's all okay. In the public galleries, we also have Darwin's beetle box at the Zoology Museum, with a few hundred beetles collected by him during his time as a student at Christ's College in Cambridge. Please do come and see this. It's on display in the museum galleries. It's just a really cool part of our collection. And Darwin was really well known for his love of beetles. And one of my favorite stories about him comes from a letter he actually sent to Jennings about one of these beetle collecting trips. You may have heard this story already because I think it's quite famous, but I'll say it again because I do really like it. So basically, Darwin had been out collecting beetles for a little while, and he had already caught 2. He had caught one in each hand. At which point he saw this beetle, a crucifix ground beetle. It's very rare today, and it was still pretty rare back in Darwin's time. And he really wanted it for his collection, but he already had a beetle in each hand, so he wasn't quite sure what to do, and he couldn't bear to not have all 3. So he writes in a letter to Jennings exactly what he did. In despair, I gently seized one of the beetles between my teeth, when to my unspeakable disgust and pain, the little inconsiderate beast squirted his acid down my throat, and I lost all 3 beetles. So here is Darwin, who we know as the famous naturalist who gave us the theory of natural selection, kind of ignoring his courses at Cambridge and putting beetles in his mouth. So I like it because there's clearly hope for all of us. And what we think happened is that one of the first beetles he collected was probably a bombardier beetle, and they emit this kind of hot, foul-tasting liquid when they're attacked by predators as a defense, and it clearly worked as all 3 beetles got away. My point with these interesting stories is that we have the historical beetle specimens mentioned in these correspondence between Darwin and Jennings, and we have historical butterfly specimens mentioned in Jennings notebooks. They're a really cool story to draw people in with, and once you have drawn them in, you can talk to them about wildlife's decline and the story that these museum specimens preserve, and including in correspondence like this kind of thing here. And crucially then, you can link this to talking about wildlife that still exists today and how we can all engage with it and help. So I mentioned partnered on the Butterflies for Time project is the Wildlife Trust for Bedfordshire, Cambridgeshire and Northamptonshire, who are one of the conservation organisations in the local area doing a huge amount of work to protect wildlife today. And I was on one of the nature reserves at the weekend, helping on their beautiful Bluebell Woods, and their promoter of the Wildlife Trust had this map on their stall. Don't worry about looking at too much detail. It's obviously quite a lot of small detail there. But basically, this is a map of the local 3 counties, Bedfordshire, Cambridgeshire, Northamptonshire. And listed all around the edge and all the black dots on the map are the more than 100 nature reserves managed in the area by the local trust. They're all completely free to visit. And at the top of the picture, the map says 95% of people in the 3 counties live within 5 miles of a wildlife trust reserve. So basically, we are very lucky. There are free wildlife reserves close to where we live. And through this project and through the work that the Wildlife Trust does, we can point people in their direction. So once we've conveyed why they should care with the losses in the museum collections, we can show them how and where to engage with modern wildlife. Okay, so that's all well and good. Those are the kind of stories that we want to engage people with. But what have we actually specifically done in terms of public engagement to achieve this goal and get people engaging with modern wildlife as well? Well, the most important element of the public engagement program that we initially planned was a multi-part series of school workshops. So this was working with target schools from North Cambridgeshire and Fenland, which our museum records showed were audiences that at the time visited the museum less frequently. There are also areas with slightly lower income where schools have a high percentage of students on pupil premium and free school meals. So we also wanted to pay for transport costs to these workshops. We don't want there to be a price barrier between engagement with the museum or the natural world. And we initially planned to run 4 sessions with 3 schools. It was going to be an introduction session at their school, a session at the Zoology Museum, a session at a local nature reserve, and then a sum-up session, final session at their school. And this way they would see wildlife in the school grounds around them every day. They would see the historical changes from the museum collection, and they would engage with the work of the local conservation organisations too. COVID did unfortunately delay and cause some issues with this part of the project, but we were able to shift some parts to be remote. For example, we gave loaned wildlife cameras to some of the schools where they could literally put a wildlife camera in the school grounds, and that could remotely take video footage of the wildlife that was in there for people to see safely when they're in lockdown. And we did manage a few in-person sessions before lockdown occurred, and more after, more since restrictions have eased as well. So before lockdown, we did some workshops at a local school in Cambridge, looking at insect senses and how they experience the world around them. These specific sets of workshops were actually run by an artist called Alex Murdin, and he brought together artists and entomologists such as myself studying insects to engage school students with insect declines. There'd been a lot of press at the time we did these workshops about insectageddon and huge losses. So I got involved as the entomologist when I was working on the Butterflies Through Time project. I love these pictures. So on the left, you can see there's a child's mind is being blown as we are using a UV light to reflect UV fluorescent material. So this is showing how insects can see the world differently to us. That lots of insects can see in the UV spectrum, and this special light reveals a kind of secret world of vision, which normally you can't see. And on the right, we then have an insect cookbook. So we're looking at insect taste. And this is actually exploring the use of sustainable insect protein in cooking. So the kids all had to go at cooking and eating edible insect protein. Some of them were a little bit wary at the beginning, but they all got involved. It turns out if you cover stuff in chocolate, they like it anyway, so it's fine. But it was really cool, and they produced this cookbook as part of that workshop as well. Once lockdown did start, we did have to shift gears quite a bit to do more remote engagement than originally planned. So yeah, the project plans were redirected quite a lot. I was extremely lucky though, because there's a brilliant public engagement team at the Zoology Museum, fronted by Ros Wade and Sarah Steele, who were also doing a lot of work at the time, trying to figure out how to do more remote engagement for the Zoology Museum. And basically, I was very lucky because I got to get involved with a lot of the things that they were doing and do Butterflies Through Time project work through that as well. So this includes, for example, on the left, the Zoology Museum blog. This was created right at the start of the first lockdown. And this had a huge amount of content for all ages. So giving information on how we can all engage with wildlife from home and help conserve it when we were locked down. Information on kind of wildlife makes, curriculum links, school resources, research stories, and much, much more. So for example, I did some pages on different species of butterfly we'd like to see in our gardens, how we can garden for them and look after them. But then I also tied in for each entry a different locally or nationally extinct species of butterfly that would have probably been found in your gardens in the past, but isn't anymore. So that was tying in the Zoology Museum collections. I've also got to help with the amazing Portals to the World program. So that's partnered with the charity Dementia Compass. These sessions are run for people with a dementia diagnosis and their care partners, and an expert from the museum delivers a talk on a subject of their choice. And there's a question and answer session. And then they also had a kind of an artwork session straight after, inspired by the talk. We trialed the first remote Zoom sessions for this throughout lockdown, so that they could continue to reach this audience that was at risk of becoming isolated. And the feedback was great. It really has been a lovely program to be a part of, and it still continues today. And you can see a bee painted here by one of the attendees from my butterfly and bee kind of garden wildlife session that we did. I mentioned at the start of the presentation that we want to increase access to the museum collection and increase collaborations in the different ways that collections are used. During lockdown, we started working with zoology undergrad students and museum volunteers, and also just general members of the public, in collaboration with the Cambridge University Herbarium, who are basically the plant counterpart to the animals in the Zoology Museum, but I think less well known, which is a real shame because their collections are amazing. We set up a remote project where students and the public could help catalogue herbarium elm specimens and record evidence of insect damage. So you can see one of the specimens here on your screen. We set this up using Zooniverse, which is a free online website for volunteering. It links volunteers and researchers. So it's a bit dark, this picture, but basically it's a plant elm specimen from a few hundred years ago, and it's got label information written at the bottom. So the volunteers were transcribing data label information and then also recording herbivory information. So basically looking at what was eating this stuff a few centuries ago. The students could use this data for their own projects, giving them experience of working with museum collections, but also data for their own work, which contributes towards their degrees. And the herbarium gets real world data collected on their specimens for them and improves the collaboration between us, them and the Zoology Museum too. So that was a really good thing to be a part of. Another thing we did for remote engagement, we wanted to encourage people to go outside still when it was safe and illegal to do so during lockdown, and record wildlife around them where they lived. So obviously they couldn't go too far, they couldn't go to the museum at the time, but we were trying to encourage recording things out of their window and also their gardens or local green spaces if they could get to them. iRecord, which is shown on the screen now, is a free website where anyone can upload wildlife recordings. It has the function to create events. So we as the Zoology Museum could create an event and invite lots of members of the public or anyone to submit recordings to it. And what's great is you don't need to know exactly what wildlife you've seen. You just need to take a picture of, say, a plant, animal, or fungi and upload it. Then expert recorders on iRecord can look at your findings and verify if they're correct or not. And if they are correct, they get sent to local record centres and conservation organisations who can use your data to monitor and guide management for species. So it's something everyone can get involved with, actually managing, monitoring and helping management for local wildlife, which is really cool. And in terms of public engagement, it's really good because you can generate summary pages like the one you see on the screen here. So on the left, you've got a map with lots of blue dots on. this shows the location, all the different people who are involved with the event sent in their data from. So we did an event in Cambridge for this one. And you can see your records alongside other people's. The bottom right, you've got a pie chart of all the breakdown of all the different types of species that people saw. So a lot of insects, understandably for this this project, were seen in this event. And you've got totals, so the number of records, species, photos that were sent in. There's even league tables. So if you wanted to compete to send in the most records, you can check who's winning on that. And we have used that to do prizes in the past. So it's good fun. Yeah, so that was a lot of remote online engagement that we did. But then finally, after almost 2 years of lockdown, we were able to go back to doing in-person public engagement events. So face-to-face with our target schools. We couldn't do quite as many as originally planned, but we were able to do a range of events again. So including going to the schools themselves and showing students all the wildlife that lives around them if they look a little bit harder for the mini beasts. And then crucially, we gave those students free tickets to bigger events on local nature reserves close by run by the Wildlife Trust to see if the sessions at the schools resulted in continued engagement with the wildlife afterwards, because that was a key goal of the project as well. So then for these events, we worked with the Wildlife Trust for Bedfordshire, Cambridgeshire, and Northamptonshire to actually put on events on their nature reserves. And we did kind of wild event days with pond dipping, crafts, mini beast hunts, and it was awesome to be back in the field again doing them. This slots into the amazing public engagement work that the Wildlife Trust already does. So the picture on your screen is actually from one of the other days that the Wildlife Trust has done in the past. But we were bringing new audiences to these reserves as well, which is great. And what was awesome to see is that more than 80% of the free tickets, so none of the tickets were paid for, but more than 80% of the tickets for these family event days on Wildlife Trust reserves were taken up by families from the schools we had visited. So clearly there was a kind of knock-on effect from the first one. They had told their parents about the Wildlife Trust and the wild events we were putting on and told them that they wanted to go, which is really, really cool. Hopefully we've kind of broken down that first barrier for engagement. And it was really common to hear on the day actually that they've lived in the area for years and never quite realized that the Wildlife Trust reserves were down the road from them. So hopefully they will continue to engage with them in the future. And even better, we've actually had people back in the Zoology Museum as well, which is really great. We have had a lot of work through, again, Roz and Sarah. They've done a great job in reopening the museum as we've been allowed to do so to more audiences. And we got to work with one of our target schools, with 3 of our target schools, sorry, where Roz worked with an artist called Eleanor Cheney, who invited the target schools students to each draw a butterfly from species that are currently exhibited in the Butterflies Through Time exhibition. These were then all added to a large display that you can see on the right of your screen. And what's cool is that then they can come and see their butterfly specimens featured alongside the real butterfly specimens from the storerooms on display in the public galleries. And we did a special family celebration event where we had the museum open late specifically for the families of students who had contributed to this piece of artwork. It was a brilliant day. It was great that all the students were showing their families which butterfly they had drawn. And even better though, they then, for many of them, it was the first time they had been to the Zoology Museum, and they were all really excited coming around, seeing this for the first time, which is exactly what we wanted from this project, to bring new audiences into the galleries. The last bit of public engagement I wanted to talk about is not so tied to our target audiences, but it's more involved with increasing access to the museum collections and different ways that we can use them. So including using them for more research. During the Butterflies Through Time project, the museum specimens have been used to gather data for student projects. So 2 just to highlight here out of quite a long list. Bethan Wallace was a master's student in the group a couple of years ago, and she did lots of work cataloguing the UK butterflies in the collection. So as I mentioned at the beginning, she was writing down all the information from specimen labels onto an electronic database. She must have done more than 4,000 specimens. It's a lot of work. And she also got lots of data from the Natural History Museum as well, because remember, they've also catalogued their insects. So it was really easy for us to get that data. But it's another argument for putting all this stuff online, because we accessed it really easily. And she used these specimens and historical notebooks like Jennings Notebooks to look at how species have changed over time and do this statistically. And sadly, her findings showed that both locally in Cambridge and nationally, far more species recorded declines than increases. And specialist butterflies that require specific resources to survive were the worst in terms of decline. So it's a sad but potentially expected finding, but a really cool way to use museum collections to extend long-term records. Another master's student, Tate Lavitt, also worked with the UK butterflies, but this time he was actually using them to extract morphological data, so measurements from the body measurements from the specimens themselves. So Tate worked on the Duke of Burgundy butterfly, a specimen you can see here on your screen, which has undergone some of the worst declines from at least the 1970s from modern records of any butterfly species in the UK. And he looked at taking measurements of wing length and width, and this kind of wing shape and size affects how far butterflies can fly and how maneuverable they are. And in the past, they've been linked to things like changes in habitat and declines in populations. So you can actually find out quite a lot about how the wing shape of a butterfly is changing. And Tate was able to extract data from Duke of Burgundy butterfly populations that no longer exist in the wild. And the results aren't yet published, but he did find that there were differences found between different habitats and at different time periods as well across the country. So that's quite exciting. And then last, but certainly not least, the final goal of the Butterflies Through Time project is to aid modern wildlife conservation. And we've done quite a few different things to do this as well. I've been helping with ongoing research on modern UK butterfly populations with the Insect Ecology Research Group, which is now continuing into my PhD. And you can see some of us here on the top right, all enjoying ourselves on one of the nature reserves owned by the Wildlife Trust. And we're looking to see how temperature and habitat requirements of different species can be managed for on Wildlife Trust reserves. As mentioned, we've been trying to publicize the ongoing conservation initiatives of the Wildlife Trust with projects like the Great Fen, engaging more people with local wildlife and the work that's been going on around them, and exposing more people to the reserves by hosting events on Wildlife Trust reserves as well. We've been providing conservation organizations with historical data from the museums that extends observations back in time before the 1970s, before when most modern observations for butterflies started. And in this way, the museum specimens kind of act like an insect time machine, which is what this strange picture in the middle right of your screen is meant to be. That was from a different project where we actually made an insect time machine collecting game. Please look that up if that sounds appealing. You travel through time with Leonard Jennings collecting insects in the Fenlands. It's fab. And we've been involved with some modern reintroduction programs as well. So in Norfolk, the large marsh grasshopper has been undergoing a reintroduction program. This is again separate from the Butterflies Through Time project, but I was able to get involved during lockdown, being run by Stuart Green and others in his team for a few years now. And volunteers literally raise hundreds of hoppers from eggs to adults in their rooms, that's what I was doing at the time, in heated tanks. And then we release the adults into their historical range. So we have specimens in the Zoology Museum so where we can see where they historically used to be. And we're now trying to reintroduce them to some of these locations before hopefully they go extinct. In terms of perhaps more specific and tangible ways that we've been, the Zoology Museum specimens have been helping with conservation. We've also been helping with the checkered skipper butterfly. I won't go into too much detail here because Jamie Wildman, the PhD student working on this, is going to be talking about it next week. But he's basically trying to build up a complete record of past historical locations where this species used to be found. This is one of our specimens. You can see the label is quite hard to decipher, but Castor hanglands 3583, so 1883. This species is no longer found in Castor hanglands. So in 1883, it was. Building up a picture of where and when it went extinct can potentially help with reintroduction attempts and figuring out what it needs and where it could live again in the future, maybe. But Jamie will be going into a lot more detail about that. So that is a very brief overview of the Butterflies Through Time project. It's a very varied body of work, and I've been extremely lucky to be a part of it. Very quickly, and then we've got time for questions. I just wanted to then flag up the Butterflies Through Time exhibition that is on at the moment, which has come at the end of the work of this project. Trying to achieve the three main goals as well: cataloguing museum specimens to then engage the public with historical changes and modern conservation. It's running until September 18th. And it's completely free to visit. We've taken butterfly specimens from the storerooms, like these large blue butterflies you can see on the left, and put them where everyone can see them in the museum galleries, in the displays. So you can see a main display case in the middle and the large blue butterflies on display on the right here. Talking about how 200 years of change from our historical notes from Jennings compare up with modern day records of how they're doing in the county. We've also got some really impressive 2-meter tall pillar displays for each of the 13 butterfly species featured in the exhibition, but this time highlighting the work of modern day researchers and conservationists working to protect these species with some high resolution photography as well. We obviously couldn't help ourselves in featuring Leonard Jennings elsewhere in the exhibition if you want to learn a bit more about him and looking at the past historical records and their importance. But also we feature some more of the modern day conservation work with Wildlife Trust for Bedfordshire, Cambridgeshire and Northamptonshire. On the right, we have the Butterfly Banks project here. So that big white letter E is a butterfly bank, and above it you see a model for scale. It's about 15 meters long in real life. And these butterfly banks have many different slopes of different aspects and shelters to create a wide range of temperatures, which will hopefully help support butterfly species into the future as climates continue to change. So that's really exciting, and hopefully something I'll do more work on in my PhD. And lastly, but certainly not least, it's the public engagement work we talked about already. So some of the drawn butterfly specimens, which Roz helped develop with our target schools and local artists, and the insect sense workshops with Alex Murdin. This one on the right is actually the scent workshop, where they tried to make foul and pleasant smelling smells and communicate those like an insect would. The classroom that we did that workshop in still smells of perfume to this day. And that's about it from me. Thank you very much for listening. I hope you enjoyed listening about my work. And if there's one kind of take-home message, I think that it's important for us to look to the past in order to fully understand what we've lost. And that means that museum specimens aren't relics. They're actually very relevant to us today and the world that we find around us. It's only then that we can really engage with wildlife that still remains around us today and learn how to appreciate and protect it. Huge thank you to the entire Zoology Museum staff, my research group, as well as staff and volunteers at the Wildlife Trust BCN. Basically to everyone who's been involved with helping on this project. It's been awesome. And please do consider, if you're not already becoming a member of the local Wildlife Trust, it's one of the simplest and best ways to support local wildlife in the area. I'll now take any questions.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Matt. That was amazing to hear all that talk and hear about the history of the project. So it makes me feel really lucky to be part of that now. And I love the note that you left it on. That was brilliant. So I know you guys will have lots of questions. Okay, so we have a question from an anonymous attendee. Where can you add bird photos? So I believe this is on the iRecord bit that you were talking about.
Yeah, so you definitely can add bird photos. All you need to do with the iRecord app, there's actually, again, more information on the Zoology Museum blog. We do a whole rundown, video rundown of how you can use that application, and there's a written Word document to go along with it as well. Literally though, if you have either the app on your phone or you have signed up for using iRecord online, you can upload an image of a bird, say, if you've taken one of those, and you can give a kind of best guess of what you think it is, or if you know what it is, you can put in the species name, and you can put in the location you saw it. And if there is a local bird expert for the group of birds that you're looking at, they can verify it for you, and that can go off to modern day conservation organizations as well, which is yeah, really cool. So you can definitely do it with birds. Yep. Okay,
amazing. Another question, how does your time machine work?
So I believe this is probably the game, I imagine, that they're talking about. Yeah, so we're actually getting the game updated. Over Christmas it got a little bit buggy, no pun intended. And but we've got it, we hopefully are getting that fixed at the moment. It invites you to have a look through modern day area of Cambridgeshire with Leonard Jennings. So on the screen, you kind of search through a field for different insects you find today. He then invites you to go back in time, get in the time machine with him, and you will see that the Cambridgeshire landscape is much wetter. It's more of the fenland area. And then you collect another set of insects, and you compare them to one another. So it's kind of basically a kind of school age group, and then you can compare the two sets of insect collections you've made. And the idea is it informs people of the changes in the local area for wildlife. That was a really fun bit of the job, writing a script for what a Leonard Jennings would say when he catches all of these different insects in different ways. It was very fun.
Yeah, the game, from what I've seen, does look really brilliant, doesn't it? I do love the little logos that we've made for it in the animation. Okay, brilliant. So another question: did the historic craze for collecting butterflies have any effect on the overall populations locally?
Really good question, and we do hear that a lot. I think the general idea is that if collection pushes a species over the edge to actually become extinct, then there has to be a pre-existing problem for that to be the final nail in the coffin. Certainly, though, what you're describing there is a real thing, that there's a kind of, I mentioned Bethan Wallace's work from her master's. She noticed peaks in collection kind of just as a species went extinct. So the idea is, oh, it's really rare now, I need to go and collect it before it goes extinct. And in turn, doing that actually drives it extinct. So certainly you do see that kind of thing. But in order for the population to have reached low numbers and become rare to garner that interest from the collectors, something else already will be having to drive that. And it will be things like, in the past, generally habitat loss and fragmentation from increasing agriculture. Looking to the future, probably more linked to climate change.
Okay, really interesting. It's really interesting to hear that the human psychology almost come into it as well.
We're weird things.
Yeah, quite unfortunate. So another question. Okay, your cataloging work sounds absolutely fantastic, very useful and very, very time consuming. How significant a problem has poor handwriting been in transcribing and digitalizing the label data? I know that you'll be able to answer this one quite well.
Yeah, it is really tricky. It's amazing. After you've done it for a while, you really get your eye in, and you kind of get a feel as well for where some of the collectors must have lived. And then, for example, there's a collector I come across a lot called S. Wakely, who I think either lived in the very south of England or on the Isle of Wight itself, because a huge number of his specimens come from the Isle of Wight. So if he's got a really difficult to decipher label, but I can make out a bit of it, I can then try and search that against Isle of Wight place names, and usually I'll find that there's a match. So spending time with the collection, so you can kind of decipher the handwriting a bit better over time anyway, but then also getting a feel for the kind of places these collectors collected from makes that easier. I would say I've had a huge amount of help from people who've been working with these collections longer than me. So Russell Stebbings is insect collections manager, Tim Sparks and Richard Priest, who basically wrote the book on Leonard Jennings. They are really good with deciphering these labels and place names as well. So more than 90%, much more than 90%, we actually have eventually got figured out. But it is definitely tricky.
Yeah, just for a bit of context, so I've taken on Matt's roles from January, and I've just started trying to decipher all these labels on the specimens. And I can tell you, as a beginner into this handwriting decipher world, it is very difficult. And Matt is definitely leagues ahead of me in that game. So
it takes time. You'll be great.
It's the practice, yeah. Okay, so are today's insects still collected and pinned for prosperity?
In some cases, yes. For better or for worse, invertebrates tend to have far fewer restrictions on collecting. So normally, though, the way that we get new specimens into the collection is someone throughout a large portion of their life will have been maybe putting their own private collection together. And then I guess normally towards the end of their life, they're looking to pass that on to someone, and then they might gift it to us to look after in perpetuity. Obviously, the stipulation being that we are now obviously more aware of the impact that collecting and killing these specimens has on their natural population. So we obviously, if there's any kind of legislation on endangered species, we wouldn't collect those. And we need to be really careful the specimens that we accept in. Sometimes being a zoology museum, people just turn up at reception desk and try and hand us stuff, and we have no idea where it's come from, so we can't do that, obviously. So yes, in some instances we do still get specimens in. especially if a researcher is currently doing a project on them as well and collecting specimens as part of their research. It's obviously really good to then use those and not get rid of them. So they do still come in, but rightfully so, the rules on how we do that are a lot tighter now for the benefit of the species that we're trying to preserve.
Cool, thank you. And another one is where can we find the recording? I think this one's more for me, actually. So we're recording all of these talks in our Researchers Talk series. They'll be put on our YouTube, but we're going to make them all available in one blog post. So this will be available at the end of all the Researchers Talk series, which is the 8th of June. So it's quite a while, as we've got 6 weeks to go through. So around then, just have a check on our museum blog and you'll be able to find a link for all the recordings for you. Okay, so Jude and Sydney asks, any top tips for supporting butterflies in our gardens?
Definitely. You can check out my blog posts on the Zoology Museum blog for that one. But the key things to think about are, can you plant a series of different flowers that flower throughout the entire course of the year, or at least the flight period for most butterflies? So from early spring through to late autumn, can you have a variety of different flowers? There's always some nectar source available. That won't just be good for butterflies, that'll be good for all sorts of pollinating species as well. So it just means as one flower kind of wilts, the next one will bloom, and there's always some food there for them. You can look on Butterfly Conservation and UK Butterflies. Those are two good websites, and they give a full list of different caterpillar food plants as well. So you can provide nectar for the adults, but you can also provide food plants for the caterpillars. Nettles, as we always say, is one of the best food plants for butterflies in this country. Things like peacock butterflies especially, and other large charismatic species that you'll recognize. Their caterpillars actually eat nettles. And loads of other insects eat nettles, and lots of things actually shelter in them. So although they are a bit of a weed in some ways, they're really good for wildlife. And if you have anywhere in your garden, you can have a kind of sunny, sheltered area. And I guess the way you can create that is by having a bit more diversity in your garden. So instead of having, I don't know, like 4 blank walls and just short grass, if you have more vegetation of different heights and create different varieties of spaces for different species, and some of those will be sheltered locations, then that is another good thing that you can do for butterflies as well.
Excellent, Matt. That was a very informative answer. That was amazing. It was a great question, so much so that Siri actually popped up and started answering it for you. So you nearly got put out of work there, Matt. Brilliant. As you said, you've written a blog post on how to garden for butterflies on the museum blog. So we're going to try and make that available for you. If someone from the museum team doesn't mind having research for that and posting that in the chat, I think that would be really helpful. It just goes over all the points that Matt's just mentioned, and got some nice little pictures for you as well. Oh, cool. So Mike asks, is there work ongoing about possible links between butterfly extinctions and climate change? There
definitely is. There's a lot of work that is currently been going on living populations today. So that's hopefully something that I'll be doing more of in my PhD with the butterfly bank work you saw. More research has been done. So in the UK, we're quite well placed to study climate change because we're often at the northern limit of a lot of the species that live in Europe. So in Central Europe, where it's warmer, a lot of species have wider ranges and less specific habitat requirements, whereas at the northern limit of the range where things are colder, they're quite restricted in where they can go. So the Wildlife Trust is literally looking as to how we can manage for butterfly species to stop them from becoming extinct. I know that there are several papers looking at the mountain ringlet butterfly. This is a species that is really only found in mountain habitats and is particularly at risk from extinction from climate change because it can only go so far up a mountain before it runs out of space as climates continue to change. It doesn't really have anywhere to move. So for vulnerable species like that, they are certainly, there's been a lot of research. And the speckled wood butterfly, one of our researchers in this talk series will be talking more about. A lot of research has been done on butterfly, the temperatures at which butterflies can take off and how butterfly behavior is also altered by temperature. So the speckled wood butterfly is a territorial species where the males normally perch and defend a little territory. But when things get warmer, they can actually be more mobile and fly around and find females. So there's a huge amount for invertebrates, particularly, that is affected by temperature. It's kind of behavior, but also distributions. And when it gets too warm as well, literally some of the specimens will kind of pass out. There's a huge amount of research been going on in different ways. So it's definitely been looked at, yeah.
Brilliant. And our next question is, how do you know who found what animal if you can't read their handwriting?
Yeah, you can't. That's a good point. It amazes me, yeah, looking at these specimens. As I said, luckily, more than 95% of the specimens we can attribute to, we can figure out what the label says. You also have to, though, rely on the recorder up to 200 years ago recording sensible information on that label. You want it ideally to have where, when it was collected, and who was collected by. If they didn't record that on the specimen, then yeah, that is lost to us, that information. And there are historical specimens in our collection, certainly, which don't have labels on. It's sort of frustrating in one sense, because it would be good to have that data, but those specimens are still useful for other reasons. So you can still do morphological measurements on them. I didn't talk about it in the talk tonight, but we have talked in different talks that are given from the museum. We mention the different technologies being used with museum collections today. Things like genetic analysis, for example, which are giving new leases of life to the myriad of ways that museum collections can be used. So although it's annoying we don't know particularly where these species came from, who collected them, they're still very useful. And of course, they can be used for engagement as well.
Okay, thank you so much, Matt. I think we just got our last question here from Laura asking, when will it be on YouTube? So another question for me. So we'll put all our researchers' talks on YouTube when we finished up the series. So it's going to be a series of talks. It's every Wednesday consecutively for 6 weeks, starting from this one until the 8th of June. So after our last talk on the 8th of June, we'll be wrapping them up, editing the videos and posting them on the blog. So keep an eye out somewhere between 8th of June and probably around the 16th of June. I would say there'll be a sort of blog post with all of the YouTube videos on there. I think that's all our questions. So I think we're just going to wrap up now. Thank you so much, Matt. It's been super interesting.
You're welcome.
We've had some amazing questions come through as well. So I know that our audience has been really engaged. And as I said, this is just the first talk in the series of our Butterflies Researchers Stories that I said is going to be running every week continuously for 6 weeks. So look forward to more butterfly researchers and hearing more about their research and their stories and the butterflies that they are studying. So we'll have another one next week with Jamie Wildman next Wednesday at same time, 7 p.m. So I hope you guys have enjoyed it. I certainly have. Been super interesting to hear all about the project. So thank you so much for coming, everyone.